Okay.
As far as pointing the camera. Okay, rolling. All right. Well, thanks for doing this. This is a pleasure to sit down with you on camera again. I think the last time we did this was an earthquake show back in Carbondale.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I'm glad there hasn't been an earthquake since we were together last.
Well, but we're better prepared thanks to your efforts. Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll start off with the early years. You're native of Naperville, Illinois?
I was born in Chicago, but raised in Naperville, yes.
What were the early influences on you that might have led you to a career in medicine?
I would say I worked in a drugstore, was an apprentice pharmacist, and under the direction of the head pharmacist was able to do some compounding. And when I went to college, I needed a job, and so I worked in the pharmacy at the medical school at the University of Chicago. And my main job was packaging up prescriptions that were being mailed out and also to deliver the medicines to the different floors of the hospital. And of course, for a freshman in college to experience the drama of being in a world-renowned institution, and had the big advantage that when I was a freshman in medical school, I was the only one in my class that knew where everything was in the hospital.
Well, I've been through that place a few times. That would be good knowledge to have. Who were some of the early influences in your medical career at the University of Chicago?
Well, in regard of education, I would say there are a couple of prior influences that then, when I got to medical school, began to influence the directions that I went. First, my mother was a great bookie. The great books of the Western world. This was Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, and Mortimer Adler started this. She was a discussion leader. We had these books all around the house. So I started reading some of the classics, and I remember doing a book report on the Communist Manifesto when I was a junior in high school, and my teacher gave me an A+ and said, "This is okay because I know your father's a Republican precinct committeeman." But because of that, I did go to the University of Chicago, fortunate enough to get a scholarship, and that was the most exciting educational experience I ever had. It was truly liberating. Small group discussions, interplay with students, bright people from all over the country. And then when I got to medical school, just sit in the lecture hall and take notes for the upcoming examination. There was very little in the first 2 years that made you even feel you were in medical school. I had some very good examples, some mentors, particularly one of the professors of pathology. I worked in his laboratory, did original research, did my first papers. He was very supportive. And one of the things that advocating reforming medical education often makes you sound as if you're anti-research. That is not the case. What I wanted to see and what was lacking was balance. The great bedside master clinician teachers that were legendary were disappearing. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have a community-based medical school was that the example for the students would be doctors who were successful in their private practice. The strict full-time faculty, when I was a student, intern, and resident, made it clear they would make rounds 3 times a week in the morning and only wanted to see the interesting patients. Now, how is that for a model? Our students see doctors who see their patients twice a day, and they're in the hospital, and that's the way it ought to be. So these were some of the things, both the positive. I liked the research side. I did that, and I got tenured at Chicago, their way. But I kept being troubled by the fact that you could teach up a storm, but it wasn't going to get you tenured.
They were, the term today seems to be like teaching to the test. You talked, I believe in your remarks to the Academy about the boards that everyone had to pass back then, and the emphasis seemed to be on making the grade, but a lot of the humanitarian aspects of medicine just weren't there.
They weren't being examined, and I'm sorry to say, in medicine, like just about everything else, the exam drives the system. And part of my external crusade was to change the examinations, and this is where, once this school was established, and the faculty did wonderful things here, far beyond anything that I had anticipated. We just wanted to have an institution, an educational institution, which is what a medical school is supposed to be.
I'm sort of jumping ahead in time here. As you said, you were tenured at the University of Chicago, but you were up against if you will, a paradigm or orthodoxy that must have just been really stifling for you.
Well, not totally stifling, but it was uphill. As soon as as chief resident, I started inventing courses and changing the conferences. They were kind of deadly there because they had a specialist in everything. And so when there would be a patient, the pontiff would pontificate and no one would argue. So I tried to set up conferences where there would be some back and forth, bring in the surgeons or the pediatricians that might have a different idea on this. I invented a course for senior medical students because the senior year had no inpatient experience at all. It was all outpatient. And these people were going to be interns the next year, and they hadn't started an IV in 12 months. So I started a sub-internship, and it was a big hit. The students loved it. It was oversubscribed, but I could only do it on my service because I was a chief resident. Then I got rumbling from other faculty members. What are you doing, Moy? Every 4 years you get a set of preceptees. And I did it the way you ignore them until the last part of the sophomore year, and then you get some residents to teach in history taking and physical diagnosis. And then you sort of try to recognize them as they rotate through your service. Well, I got them the first year they were in medical school, got them over to Billings Hospital, put white coats on them. We started going to pathology conference. I had them all subscribe to the New England Journal of Medicine, and we discussed the articles. And what they found was their basic sciences started to make sense. There were reasons they were studying this. And so they got very excited about that. And I got calls from other preceptors, Moy, what are you doing over there? I'm getting calls from my freshmen. Yeah, we're teachers.
And this would have been in the mid-'60s, thereabouts, mid to late '60s?
The '60s, yeah.
Long about those times, about that time, Delight Morse was looking into professional schools at the
famous envelope.
Yes, yeah. We've all seen that. You know, and he was working on a law school, working on a medical school. How did you come in contact with the administration down there? How did they sound you out, or how did you get to know them?
I suspect that I started an organization called the Mid-America College Health Association. One of my administrative assignments was to run the University Health Services, which included the Student Health Service. And we did not have a regional group, so I got together with some of my colleagues and we put one together. And one of the people that was in that group was Dr. Richard Lee, who was director of the Student Health Service in Carbondale. And we got to know each other pretty well. And I suspect that he put my name in the list because we did often talk about the problems in medical schools. As I said at the Academy, I got a nice letter from Chancellor McVicker, and would you like to be a candidate for dean? Well, you know, deans are old men with gray hair. I still haven't achieved that, but I didn't think they'd be serious. I almost pitched the letter, but I thought my wife would enjoy it. So we were going to buy a new house in Hyde Park that afternoon. I came home early. The realtor was late. So I said, oh, you might be interested in this. And I showed her the letter. And she said, we can't buy a house. She said, why? I said, you have to answer this letter. And I said, come on, they can't be serious about this. She said, I've heard you grumbling about medical schools for years, and you answer that letter. The realtor showed up. She told him we weren't going to buy a house after all. He was kind of upset.
What was Southern looking for in a medical school in the area of downstate Illinois? What were the needs and the issues that we faced in that area?
The main reason for medical schools at that time, there were some that were true and obvious, and one that was totally phony and that didn't come out until a decade later. The primary reasons were the lack of primary care physicians in smaller communities and the maldistribution of doctors. Even those we had clustered around sophisticated hospitals and metropolitan areas. So the decision to start a downstate medical school and to expand the University of Illinois College of Medicine at the same time was based on the perceived need to have more physicians in Illinois, and particularly in primary care, since everybody was going into specialties. And this was the reason that they did it down here. It's sort of interesting that the city of Springfield actually held off the University of Illinois. They wanted this to be another campus of the U of I College of Medicine, like Peoria and Rockford and Champaign-Urbana. But previous interactions with the hospitals in Springfield and the leading doctors trying to get residency programs, continuing education activities were rebuffed. And some went over to Champaign-Urbana and talked to President Henry to try to get some downstate educational activity in Springfield, and he told them, if we do anything downstate, it'll obviously be in Champaign-Urbana. Thank you very much, don't call me. So when it was clear Springfield was going to get some of the action, it was the physicians in Springfield that said, we want to go with Southern. And at that time, under Delight Morris, SIU had a wonderful reputation of just slogging into anything where education could be a solution to a problem. The phony reason was, at that same time frame, there was tremendous pressure to get into medical school. Guadalajara started up, and Grenada, and going to Italy to go to medical school. And so there was a perceived need that we had to have more medical schools because of this tremendous pressure of young men to get into medical school. Well, that stopped as soon as the Vietnamese War was over. And it was quite clear that this huge demand to get into medical school was a lot of people that wanted to stay out of being drafted. Now, fortunately, at the same time, we were going from about 10–15% women to about 50% women in medical school. And so as the men applicants fell off, the women applicants came right in at the same time. Or by 1980, we would have been in the embarrassing situation of having places in medical schools that weren't filled.
It's not horrible, it was there.
Okay. If you don't mind if I ask that again. What was the need of downstate Illinois for primary care physicians that helped drive this whole notion of a medical school for Southern Illinois University?
The old GPs were dying off and retiring. And the medical schools at that time, the models and the lure was to go into specialties. And a specialist really can't thrive in a small community. The other was that all the little Hillburton hospitals, 50, 60, 70 beds, could not keep up with modern technology. They simply did not have the financial resources to justify getting the now more and more expensive things. And as a result, the physicians in downstate Illinois who were there were increasingly graduates of foreign medical schools. And while some of them were excellent, some of them were not very good, and people were then driving a long way. It was hard to get people to cover the nursing homes. Nobody was making house calls and such all. So there was a demand for physicians to take care of people in downstate Illinois. And in the same time frame, a new specialty called family practice had evolved. It was clear that this school was to meet that need, and we started 5 family practice residency programs scattered around central and southern Illinois, because the major determinant of where a young man or woman sets up practice is where they finish their residency, because that's where they probably got married and that's where their immediate job offers. Why don't you just stay here and join my practice?
Sure. And again, about the SIU issue, physicians in the Springfield area have not met with much success trying to get the University of Illinois interested in doing something.
No, they tried several times, and the University of Illinois was clearly not interested in doing anything in terms of medical education or postgraduate educational activities in Springfield, and this was upsetting to many of the physicians. And as a result, when the Campbell Commission was going around looking for different sites, and they were clearly looking at Springfield as a clinical center, the physicians made it clear that if they were to start a medical school, they wanted to do it with SIU.
SIU did a lot of things right in those days in the sense of you had you brought in real talent to start different things like Guy Renzaglia at the Rehabilitation Institute in Center in Carbondale. I can go Buren Robbins in broadcasting and so on and so forth.
And the fisheries program.
Oh, exactly.
My son's a graduate of that.
Well, precisely. What was the allure or the energy that Morris and SIU had at the time?
There just never were too precious that they couldn't get into the smut and grime of trying to find an educational solution to a social problem.
There's a saying right now. You know, Glenn Bouchard is the president, and Glenn talks about Southern Illinois being on the western edge of Appalachia and the northern edge of the Mississippi Delta, and there's some unique challenges there to be met, aren't there? How was the medical school going to start to address those?
We had, of course, an admissions policy, and if we were going to get graduates to look at downstate Illinois, we needed to take them from central and southern Illinois. Kids, frankly, from Evanston and Kenilworth weren't going to set up in Pinckneyville. So that was one of the things that we set up, and it was a mantra we all had. The purpose of the SIU School of Medicine is to assist the people of central and southern Illinois to meet their health care needs. We kept this before us because while many of us had a strong agenda to reform medical education, we knew what brought us here and who was paying the bill. And so we had to be sure that while you can't indenture your graduates, that with all the lures, the positive things you could do, that we would come out with a product that was needed.
When it came time to put the structure together for this school and the curriculum, how did your thoughts on the need to reform medical education enter into the whole process? How did you attract the kind of faculty who had the same kind of buy-in?
The first thing that I established was the curriculum is centrally controlled. In a typical medical school, the dean or the associate dean for academic affairs would assign a certain number of hours to the biochemist, 91 hours. Do your thing. Well, their thing was, well, let's see that they do well in the national boards and then we'll all feel good. Well, what was different here was the curriculum was centrally controlled by experts, professionals who had degrees and training in the educational process. Just because you're called a professor doesn't mean you can profess. That now, I'm glad to say, is required for accreditation of American medical schools, that the curriculum be under the control of the dean's office and centrally operated. That was one of the biggest reforms. Otherwise, as one dean told me when I was going around gathering episodes, he said, we decided to start a traditional medical school first, get accredited, and then innovate later. And he said, once you give the biochemist 91 hours, they won't give one up, they won't take another one, and they won't talk to anybody about it. The unknown for me was, were there kindred souls around the country? And fortunately there were. Had the same frustrations. And so the first chairman that we recruited, each one of them was a master teacher and had been frustrated that these things were not requited. They had done it the traditional way. They'd become professors and such. But we all rallied around the fact that we really wanted to create an exciting environment where the students would be having fun and experience the drama of learning medicine instead of sitting in a lecture hall with a clipboard.
And this model, and I've seen it so many times over the years, seems to be so patient-centered, so in touch with the needs. You're not looking at the patient presenting as an illness, you're looking at the person first. It seems that's the way it's
That's the way you practice medicine. The impersonality of the traditional medical school irritated me. When I was a student, the interns and residents would refer to the liver in room 14, the lung up in 318, things like that. They were simply reflecting the models that they had seen. And the fragmentation of the curriculum meant that you were studying biochemistry here, you studied physiology here. They weren't talking to each other. So why not start with a patient? And with our standardized patients, it's a person you can talk to. They have a history, x-rays, laboratory tests, and do it the way doctors do it. Here's a whole person. We have to figure out what's going on here. Well, then you use the faculty as consultants. And you begin to teach others in your group. And as you well know, if you have to tool up to teach something, you remember it far better than if you're sitting passively in that lecture hall with a clipboard. This is the magic of our first 2 years, is that by starting with patients' problem solving, at the end of 2 years they've had a course in anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, because the faculty designed it that way. That takes work, but isn't that what they're being paid for?
This leads to a question about, of course, problem-based learning.
Right.
You brought in the best people on that, some of the very early
Absolutely.
pioneers.
Absolutely. Howard Barrows is a genius. And I take full credit for recruiting him. But what happened after that is clearly to his credit. He is a visionary. He is persistent, and he's one of those people that you just have to constantly reassure but hold back a little bit at the same time, because they have such a clear vision of what ought to be, and the rest of the world doesn't quite seem to see it the same way or fast enough. He invented this when he was on the faculty in California. He was a neurologist, and they didn't always have patients in the hospital to demonstrate what he was teaching the students about. So he trained his nurse to mimic Parkinson's disease and various kinds of palsy and things like that. She became very good at it, and she herself became a professor of education at school in Canada. He then took this to McMaster's, which probably is our counterpart in Canada. And we had solved content in some process here, but I really wanted to focus in on the process of learning, and Howard Barrows just did a wonderful job. I had to use a little bit of leaning on some of the faculty to do it his way. Once they saw the strength of it, it was an easy sell. And
you ended up being able to attract an entire cadre of people who, like Barrows, were innovators.
Yes. Of course, being the original Department of Medical Education, started publishing. And finally, there were complaints from the one journal in the United States that published papers on medical education that other people were complaining they couldn't get papers published because SIU had 1, 2, or 3 articles every time it came out. So we started a second journal. There are now 2, and we doubled the potential for being published. But this got a lot of national attention. And then our people got being elected to offices in the educational divisions of the Association of American Medical Colleges. And probably the biggest coup was when the medical school in Geneva, Switzerland recruited one of our professors to start a Department of Medical Education and introduce problem-based learning. And when her dean became president of the university, he saw to it that the ideas began spreading around Switzerland. And so that's probably one of our more notable international impacts.
I'm jumping ahead, but that really is one of the great traditions, one of the great changes in medical education that started right here.
Well, I'll tell you another anecdote. They held a debate, wanted to have a debate on medical education, critical issues in medical education. They decided to square me off with the Dean of Harvard at the Council of Deans meeting, and it was a big hit. We didn't disagree on a lot, but the discussion went on so long afterwards with the deans that they had to cancel the next part of the program. And what really intrigued me was how many people came up and said, you know, this is the first time at these meetings that we've ever discussed medical education. Can you imagine that? Well, I got to know Dean Tostesen very well, and I invited him to come as a commencement speaker, and he asked if he could come early because he wanted to spend some time with our Department of Medical Education. And he did, and he was fascinated with it, and after he gave his address, I was driving him out to the airport, And he said, Dick, you are spending more on the process of educating your medical students here in Springfield than we do at Harvard. And he said, I have to correct that. And so he did what Harvard does. They endowed the curriculum, went out and raised millions of dollars. And years later, they started what they called the Oliver Wendell Holmes track, which was the SIU program.
Let's talk about the actual environment of the medical school for a moment, because it's normally you have a teaching hospital associated with the university. Mm-hmm. It's all part and parcel of the same
right.
system. A lot different here. You have Memorial Hospital, you have St. John's Hospital, then you have the first-year medical students down in Carbondale mm-hmm. getting their grounding. How did this whole model evolve? It's kind of a school without walls, I've heard it described.
That was the catchphrase that Chancellor MacVicar used. It was a concept of making maximum use of existing resources. The College of Science in Carbondale, two big 600-bedded hospitals that were very sophisticated here in Springfield, which was, outside of St. Louis, the closest community that had the hospital capacity. Because it was to be community-based and we were going to have many of the faculty members who were doctors in practice in the community, I didn't want to recreate a, quote, university teaching hospital. That's why, even though it took months, I worked to get essentially equal affiliation agreements with both hospitals. Because a small medical school in 1,200 beds was not going to change any hospital to become a university teaching hospital. The board at Memorial, I think, would have been willing to do that. I was concerned that would not be a good idea. So we have a situation where there is plenty of room for people who didn't want to be part of the medical school to continue their practice, and also for those who wanted to participate, and for our full-time faculty, join the staff through all the same rules and serve the same offices and such all. And it meant that our students were seeing people who were successful in practice. Frankly, people who were not good practitioners weren't invited to join the faculty. And there were tensions in those early days, and that was part of the time. Sometimes I'd have to strap on my 6 guns at high noon and go out and blaze away, and fortunately won.
There's a distinction, I think, between the first class that graduated here and the charter class. Mm-hmm. Could you go into that for us?
When it came time for accreditation, and they came every year, we got really good at that. But yeah, this is part of becoming an American medical school. And when finally we were ready to start our first class in Carbondale, the accreditation people said, actually, Springfield is ready right now. And there are still 3 two-year medical schools at that time. There aren't any now. They're in both Dakotas and in Reno, Nevada. And one of the problems they had is after you finish the first 2 years, what do you do now? So they said, as far as we're concerned, you could go to the 2-year schools and recruit an advanced standing class. So I flew up to the Dakotas, and one of my assistant deans went out to Reno, and we put together a class of 25 students. And they came and went through our curriculum. A few of them weren't quite prepared for some of it. There was one young man who thought medical humanities was just terrible. Then he went off to a surgical residency in Indianapolis. And he came back on a Saturday looking around for somebody to talk to. He was on his way to a meeting to apologize for all the things he'd said about medical humanities, because he now had a reputation for having a knack of dealing with dying patients and their relatives. And at a county medical society meeting, he stood up and corrected the speaker who had made an error about something in medical jurisprudence. And he decided, this is part of medical education after all. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. You also started something different here too, with bringing underrepresented groups into the curriculum or into the profession through the med prep program.
Yeah.
That was something, I don't know that there was another model like that around the country.
Not like that, no. It became a model. The assumption was that there was a barrier to minorities, particularly blacks, at the admissions committee level. That wasn't the case. It was a lack of supply of qualified minority applicants. And I talked to the dean at Howard and asked him, what is the problem here? Obviously, they're bright young kids that ought to be able to be competitive. And he said the problem, Dick, is the inner city high schools. It's not cool to be smart. And he said this is the reason that there are more women succeeding to getting into medical school, because the otherwise would be qualified black males are a day late and a dollar short when they come as freshmen, and they're taking remedial courses. So by the time they're in their junior year and getting ready to apply to medical school, they piled up a bunch of C's and remediation, and they're still catching up. So it occurred to us, and again, this is when it's nice to have professional educators on your faculty. This means that if we set up a program to help them catch up in another year, year and a half, whatever, that we should be able to increase the supply. They're smart enough. It's an educational problem. Let's fix it. So we set up this program that not only used existing courses, but on study skills and such all. Well, as you know, it's a big success. And it provided us with a 10 to 15% African American enrollment, which I don't think we would have had otherwise. It also supplied the University of Illinois, and 2 states, Iowa and Ohio State, gave scholarships to our graduates of the Med Prep program. State of Illinois wouldn't do that. I used to argue with the Board of Higher Education that they were paying for Med Prep. Why not protect your investment? Anyway, it's a great program and very successful. And I would say one of the things that a real credit I give to that faculty is their counseling is such that there are some aren't going to make it, and they have to ultimately tell them, you really aren't going to be able to get into medical school. I have never had one grievance from that process. So I think the relationship that they have with the students is one of trust, and the changing their aspirations, maybe go to another health profession or something like that, but to not encourage them to bang their head against the wall when it isn't going to work. But there are a lot of successes.
As time went on, of course, we started to grow expertise in certain kinds of research, like Alzheimer's. I'm thinking back to that. Today, of course, the Cancer Institute is up and going. And
plastic surgery.
Have a new bill. Yes. How did those more traditional research kinds of activities meld with the training of primary care physicians? How does it all coexist here?
Well, first of all, we were never anti-research. And we built laboratories in this very building, clearly with the expectation that quality research would go on. What we made clear were 2 things. Everybody teaches, and everybody teaches well. And that everybody doesn't have the same job description in the department. I expected the departmental chairman to provide teaching, research, and service. It didn't mean everybody had the same job description. So if a person were primarily committed to doing research, that's fine. They had to be an effective teacher. But then when it came for a promotion and tenure decision, they were based on that. They had better be pretty effective, had gotten grants, and published, as a traditional medical school would. But we had others who would primarily be in service and education. But if they were, we expected them to be creative and scholarly and publish papers in the journals of education and such all, and be outstanding teachers. Now, I had to go to the mat with a few presidents down in Carbondale over that issue, but they eventually saw it my way.
As you look back now with the emphasis on training primary care physicians and keeping them in Illinois, how has this School of Medicine changed the delivery of health care in rural and downstate Illinois?
Well, we have graduates all over the place. The other thing is that we worked, there are some very energetic people that were on the dean's staff that were out in communities. And we had to change their expectations. If you have a community of 12,000 that's proud that they haven't passed a blankety-blank school bond issue in the last generation, you're talking about recruiting to that community young men and women who want their kids to have the same educational opportunity they did. This is why it's difficult for any professional that wants to have a family to live in a small town. The Little Hill Burton hospitals just weren't going to make it on their own. And they had to become affiliated with the system. And what we have now are systems of hospitals and clinics. There was one community downstate, I thought they were going to lynch my person because he was telling him, you really should close the hospital. We won't have any industry. Well, you know, industry isn't going to come anyway because of the rinky-dink hospital you have. But you really had to get through to people that what you need is a delivery system where people can come and say, I can practice here because I can take care of my patients. And we have worked on telemetry, television, high-tech, so that if you practice in a smaller community and your hospital is attached to Memorial or St. John's or St. Louis hospitals and you have high-speed communication with specialists, then you don't feel so sequestered. You also have helicopters that can get your patient if it's a big emergency. And so for some communities, all they needed was an entity that was doctor's offices, an emergency room, maybe attached to the community nursing home, where everybody gets together, they save overhead costs, and they have high-speed communications with a medical center, and they can land a helicopter. And now you can say, hey, I could live there, because that's the kind of town I grew up in, and my kids can have a pony and things like that.
You also looked for new ways to be of service when there were specific needs, such as, I remember very vividly, I was in news at the time when we had the big earthquake scares of the late 80s and around 1990. How did you take a look at things like that and see how the School of Medicine could be of service in the case of, say, an earthquake along the Nemadrid Fault?
Well, it was the Nemadrid Fault that got me started on it. And I actually went down to St. Louis to talk to a geophysicist about the Nemadrid Fault, and he showed me the maps where damage would occur, and it became obvious right away Springfield would be the closest still intact major medical community to southern Illinois. Now, I couldn't take on Missouri and Arkansas and Tennessee and Kentucky, but Illinois, particularly with our parent university down there, you know, you get a Richter 7.5, Richter 8. They weren't prepared, and it would be a disaster. And the hospitals would collapse. They would be a net creator of casualties. So this troubled me, and what are we going to do? The golden hours, those 6, 8, 12 hours where people can be, their shock can be treated and infections can be controlled, burns can be treated. How do we reach out to that? Well, fortunately, my associate dean was thick with some general in the Illinois Reserves, and so we started talking about maybe the National Guard could help with this. And the first time we tried it, it was just a carnival. So we had to go back and replan it and do a lot better job. And that second try, it worked very well. But it meant that the Carbondale National Guard and the Springfield Army National Guard that had helicopters had to coordinate. Our hospitals had to cooperate. We had to identify physicians and nurses who would be flown down to where the National Guard would set up the camp there, tent hospitals, and the surviving doctors would join them. We would back them up and do the triage and stabilization to get people out, first to Springfield and then with fixed-wing aircraft to Chicago or Peoria, whatever. It worked. It's a model. It's there. I don't know if anybody's dusted it off in a while, but it was just, here we would be with everything we could do in a modern medical center, and 170 miles away, our friends and colleagues are dying because we can't get together.
Let's take a look now at the way that things have evolved. As you look at Memorial here in the School of Medicine campus, and over to St. John's, you now have the medical district growing together, and the first funds, of course, are going into that. And the development here is really, really incredible. How do you feel about the way things are going?
I'm delighted. Actually, I envisioned that this would happen. And I'll tell you, the first year I was here, the Secretary of the County Medical Society told me that they didn't want me to say in my talks that the advent of a medical school would improve the quality of health care in Springfield, that I should say that the medical school is here because the quality of health care is so good. I said, okay, it'll happen. And so what I envisioned was that between Memorial and St. John's, once this thing was up and going, would be not only more buildings and institutes, but also industries and services related to major health activities. And that Springfield would become a regional medical center, probably the definitive one between Chicago and St. Louis, and that's what's happening.
As you look back on your career, there's so many different areas where you can take some real satisfaction in what's been accomplished here. As you take stock of things, what does give you the most satisfaction? Do you have where do you look back and say, boy, we really did something?
That is, as I mentioned earlier, the examination drives the system. And fortunately, I had a long enough tenure as dean. The half-life of medical deans in the United States is a little less than 4 years, and I was a dean for almost 24. That gave me an opportunity to exert persistence and finally seniority at the national level. And as a result, examinations were changed. Another dean and I hounded the Association of American Medical Colleges until they put essay questions on the medical college admissions test. Pre-med experience is a horror. My older son started out as a pre-med and got out of it. He didn't want to be associated with those barracudas. They're grade grubbers, and they purposely did not take liberal arts courses because they might get a C, and that would ruin their grade point average. So, all right, we'll make them take English seriously. So they finally put essays on the medical college admissions test. The educator pros said, we can't grade that. And I said, I don't care. Send the essays to the admissions committee in the medical schools, let them read them. They do now grade them, fortunately. But I said, just the fact that there are essays is going to drive people to take English seriously. But the big change was what used to be called the national boards. It's now called the United States Medical Licensure Examination. You heard me talk about the national boards, which was essentially 3 examinations based on memorizing facts and spitting them back out. What we did here, and this again is Howard Barrows using standardized patients, we proved that you can use living people, come up with a reliable, valid examination of skills and behavior. Then I had a hammer I could pound. I went to national meetings and I just pounded on the national board that they are an academic achievement examination, not a licensure examination. You don't get more or less licensed. You either are licensable or you are not. They should be asking important questions, not way out factlets, and you aren't measuring behavior and skills. So I said, you're very reliably measuring about 1/4 of what you really want to know about a physician. By golly, they put me on the national boards. They guess they want me to shut up. Well, we finally end up now, this past year was the first time that hands-on clinical skills examination are part of the United States Medical Licensing Examination, and they have changed it to a licensing examination. It is now criterion referenced, not norm referenced, which means you have important criteria that must be met, not how many facts did you memorize. So I would say what this school, and I give Howard Barrows a lot of credit and a vigorous faculty and people that were all over the Association of American Medical Colleges at different levels of its activity saying the same thing. Medical schools now have to put out a better product, and the United States populace is better protected that this is a competent person than they were. And this medical school did it, and I'm very proud of that.
Would that be your criterion for the best measure of success for this place?
Oh, the best measure of success is always the people that you graduate. And the high point every year for me was commencement. And giving that diploma mostly to people I didn't know very well, because I was also dean and provost, which meant that a lot of the deaning was done by the associate deans, and I was running a campus and spending a day in Carbondale every week. The only students I got to know very well were the ones who were in trouble, which is they would end up in my office. So it always pleased me, these bright young people that had done so well and were going off to great residency programs, and each year a lot of them going into primary care, which is what we were all about. That was the high point for me, was commencement.
I have to wrap this up, but there was a comment that you made toward the end of your remarks to the Academy that I just loved. Was it, you mentioned an administrator down at Carbondale.
Oh, Willis Malone.
Okay, okay. Well, tell me that story. There was well, we're going to let you go in. We don't know anything about running the medical school. We hope you do, and we'll...
Well, the lead-in, which I mentioned briefly in my comments, was that medical schools are a headache for university presidents. Their classrooms are in the real world. Half the faculty makes more than the president does. If you offend them, they'll go out and make even more. They need 12-month contracts. Everybody else has a 9-month contract. And when you're 170 miles away, this is compounded because now you're a separate campus. Well, most presidents get irritated with existing medical schools. When you're starting a new one, all of this comes at once. And repeatedly, I would have to go down and ask for exceptions or variations, but I need to do it this way. And often they had to go to the board to get the university's ways changed. And I knew this had to be irritating. And so I mentioned this to Willis Malone, who was the academic vice president. And I said, I really appreciate your flexibility and cooperation. I'm sure that this has been annoying at times. And he says, well, Dick, he says, the president and I have discussed just that point. And we came to the conclusion that you know more about medical schools than we do, so we'll just keep doing it your way until you blow it, and then we'll fire you.
Well, you stayed on 24 years, so
yeah.
You must have been doing something right.
Well, I guess so.
We've covered an awful lot of ground.
Yeah, you've got more than 20 minutes here.
I think we're in good shape.
All right.
Let's check tape and make sure we're okay. Thank
Well,
you.
I'm delighted with the current dean, because he is a graduate of our school. And I know that the things that were important to me, such as education, medical humanities, and the community-based nature of the school, are important to him. And I think he's doing a great job of maturing it, like the Cancer Institute. That's super. That's what should be here. And I anticipated things like that would be here. And there'll be more of them. But just remember, we're school teachers.
Excellent point, Dan. Thank you so much.